everybody. Today we're going to be learning about section 8.7, which is about persistent organic pollutants, which are often called POPs for short. The learning objective for today is that you can describe the effect of POPs on ecosystems. Some of the essential knowledge that we're going to gain is what persistent organic pollutants are, how it is that they are toxic, and the ways that they can be dispersed. So, as I said earlier, POPs, as I'm going to refer to it throughout these notes, actually stands for persistent organic pollutants. Now, persistent means they're long-lasting, and organic just means they are carbon-based pollutants. So these are going to be synthetic. They are human-made, they are not natural, and they are compounds that do not easily break down in the environment, which means that they can accumulate and build up in water and soil. They're also going to be fat soluble, which means that they can also accumulate and persist in animals' fat tissue instead of just passing through the body. So they aren't easily going to be dissolved into blood or urine. They aren't going to be peed out. They are going to stay in the fat tissues of these animals. So as we see from this diagram here, the little purple parts are going to represent the POPs, and then the yellow parts are the fat cells. So what can happen is it's going to build up in there, and then very slowly it will be released from the fatty tissue into the bloodstream, which can then impact the brain and other organs over time, especially the reproductive system. So as fat is slowly burned through various processes, you're going to get it slowly kind of continually being released because it's all stored up in that fat. And then it's going to be something that you accumulate, and then slowly it will be leached out like into your body as the fat is being released. So I apologize, this is going to be kind of like a long list of slides, but there's kind of a lot of these examples that you need to know about. And I'm going to start with on the left-hand side here, just going through all of the examples, and then I'm going to kind of highlight some of the groups of them. So some examples that you will commonly hear referenced in case studies, some of the important ones that have been studied, is going to be DDT. Now, this is actually an outdated insecticide. It has been banned in most developed countries, but it still is sticking around. It was a widely used insecticide, but now that it has been phased out, it is not widely used, but it still exists in the soils and sediment and aquatic ecosystems, and then it builds up in the food web. We also have PCBs, which are present in plastics and as a paint additive. We have PBDEs, which are used for fireproofing. We have BPA, which is a plastic additive. We have dioxins, which are used in fertilizer production, and they're released for the combustion of waste and biomass. We have phthalates, which are found in plastics. And then we have perchlorates, which are a lot of times seen with military usage because they're used in rocket and missile fuel, and they're also used in fireworks, but specifically we're going to see those pretty heavily concentrated in military areas. So a large group of these is going to be pesticides, and I specifically highlighted DDT. Now, obviously, we still have a bunch of pesticides that have not been banned, but as you can imagine, they're going to do the same thing that DDT does, where they're going to be persistent in soil and sediment, and they can build up. Now, we also have a lot of medications, which I didn't give specific examples, but these are going to be pharmaceutical compounds like steroids, reproductive hormones like birth control, antibiotics, and these are going to be things that pass through the human bodies, and then they get into the sewage, just like our whole treatment system. So when you have extra amounts of these, you are going to urinate them out, which is going to end up in the toilet, which ends up in the sewage treatment, and that is going to get treated, and then it's going to be sent to your waterways. Now, the problem is we do not have ways for filtering out these pharmaceutical compounds in our sewage treatment plant. So it's going to go through and it's going to be released. So those steroids, those hormones, those antibiotics are going to be released into the waterways. And so they're going to persist in streams and rivers. They're going to make their way down into oceans, and they can disrupt aquatic organisms' endocrine functions. So they can be endocrine disruptors. Then we also have dioxins, which is going to be kind of, again, like a bigger grouping. And these are going to be byproducts of fertilizer production and burning of medical waste, fossil fuels, and biomass, as I briefly mentioned during the examples. Now, this is going to be one that humans will end up taking in, as actually all of these humans could take in, like pesticides, the medications, we're already taking it. But dioxins is going to be one where we're seeing that like 90% of human dioxin exposure is going to come from the animals that we eat, because it's going to be built up in the animal fat tissue. So as we're eating meat, dairy, fish, all of these, we're going to be exposed to these dioxins. And so 90% of it is coming from literally what we eat. So some more examples, the PCBs, which I said were additives in paints and plastics. These are slowly released into aquatic ecosystems by industrial wastewater, and they're going to be toxic to fish. They're going to cause spawning failure and endocrine disruption. So they're going to have effects on the population as it is having issues with reproduction and offspring being successful. It also can cause reproductive failure and cancer in humans. And so human exposure is going to be coming, again, through animal products, through the animals that we are eating. We also have the perchlorates, which, as I said, was the more military one. And it's going to be especially common because military testing is where we're going to have like rocket, where we're going to have like those missile launching. It is also going to be around near rocket launch pads. So think of like as NASA is shooting off its rockets, there's going to be a lot of perchlorates there. And this is also going to be able to remain in the soil and can leach into groundwater or run off into surface waters. Now, as we're seeing, a lot of these are going to be sticking around in the soil and making their way into water. But it's also important to be aware that POPs can travel long distances through wind and water. So they can impact ecosystems far away. And this diagram, I think, is really helpful here. So let's imagine there's a POP that's being released from a like specific factory right here. Now, you might not live anywhere near this factory, but it can get actually into like the water and the water cycle. It can be rained down. It can have runoff, which can get into the fish and build up. And then by the time that you're eating it, you're actually going to be consuming it. It can end up in our waterways that we get our drinking water from. It can end up being eaten by the animals that are eating the grass that's growing in the soil. And so all of these things, it's going to be traveling through wind, it's going to travel through water, it can be dropped through rain, and all of this is going to be ways that these POPs can actually be spread out much farther than just the one place where they are being produced. And this is why it's really important for these things to be regulated and for us to know the levels of things that are being released, because it's not just one area. It can impact for like wide ranges outside of this one place where it's being released. All right, this is going to be your practice FRQ for 8.7, where you're going to practice the suggested skill of explaining environmental concepts and processes. So I want you to explain why the release of PCBs, which is an example of a POP, why the release of PCBs into an aquatic ecosystem may have longer lasting negative impacts on organisms than the release of synthetic nitrates. So that's your practice FRQ for 8.7. Those are your notes on 8.7, and I hope you learned something.